So I asked for some recommendations on videos related to Canadian history, and someone recommended this, and the title was of course very interesting to me: When Canada Burned Down the White House, the War of 1812. Now, I learned a little bit about this by listening to a song a while ago, but it's not something I know too much about. Or know pretty much anything about, honestly. The War of 1812, again, I've heard of. It involved the UK, of course. But it's not a part of history that I know a huge amount about. So, interested to learn more about the War of 1812 itself. And, yeah, a time when Canada burned down the White House. Tell me what you think about that as a Canadian. Interested to learn about it. Let's watch.
So it is 1783, and the Treaty of Paris has just been signed between the US and Britain, which means, yay, the colonies are independent. Though that did not mean that both sides were still not very buddy-buddy with each other, and were also still doing stuff to piss each other off. So when France decided screw monarchy and went to conquer most of Europe, Britain and friends went to war with them. And Britain, doing what it does best, sent its big chungus navy to blockade France. Only problem was they did not have enough sailors. And this was not helped by the fact that many British sailors hopped on over to American ships, as they did not want to serve in the Navy. So Britain did the only logical thing and started boarding the ships of a neutral nation and yoinked British deserters, even the ones that had become American citizens. Now, of course, this wasn't an exact science, as the British probably took quite a few American sailors who had never even set foot in Britain. Another thing the Brits did to piss off the Americans was their support of the many Indian tribes fighting the US, and then passing the Ordnance Council, which required American ships to dock in Britain and pay tax before trading with other European powers.
Yeah, I can kind of see why a lot of people don't like the history of Britain or what Britain did in its own history, pissing off the Americans here in a multitude of ways as well. Let's let him
But eventually, the British Prime Minister, Robert Jenkinson, decided to smooth things out and rescinded the Ordnance Council. But unfortunately, it was not like he could just text the Americans what's up, and it took about 3 weeks for the message to cross the Atlantic. Well, in that time, the Americans decided that they had had enough and declared war. But this wasn't just because America was salty with Britain, but also because they really wanted Canada. And who could blame the US for this? Canada has free healthcare, poutine, and Michael Cera. Now, the US was a bit optimistic about the whole thing, and while yes, they had more troops than Britain and North America, they were of a lower quality, and they only had 17 ships to Britain's over 1,000. They also believed that the Anglo-Canadians would just see the light and side with the Americans. So the US rushed in to attack the British in Upper Canada from Detroit with a numerically superior army, and promptly lost and had to give up Detroit. They were also not helped by the fact that the Anglo-Canadians stayed loyal, and so did the Quebecers, as they kind of liked their deal with Britain, where they could be Catholic and French, something they feared that the Americans would take away. Meanwhile, in northern Michigan, the British attacked the American garrison there, who had no idea there was even a war going on, because again, no texting in 1812. Also, a bunch of native tribes ended up siding with the British, as they were not too fond of the whole manifest destiny thing.
That's interesting. Yeah, you see, like, it's interesting to see that loyalty from the Canadians. Got to respect that. Was that strong possibility that the Americans would have stopped the Quebecers being Catholic or being able to practice Catholicism? And yeah, interesting to see the Native Americans siding with the British as well. I guess it kind of makes sense. They were probably being trying to be wiped out by the Americans.
And Britain gave them some vague promises about their own Indian state. So the Americans tried invading again, amassing a force in upstate New York, but then immediately got clapped by the British after crossing the Niagara River. In 1813, the Americans tried again to take back Detroit, but one of the American commanders screwed up and marched his force ahead of the main force and got destroyed by the British, which kind of bungled the whole thing. But the Americans finally did something that did not immediately flop on its face, when they crossed Lake Ontario to take Toronto and then saw some success taking several forts along the Niagara River. Down south, though, conflict flared up between the US and Creek natives, which Britain, along with Spain, who wasn't even fighting in the war, supported the Creeks. The US did its thing, of course, and defeated them and forced them to cede even more land away. Around this time, the US got a boat to Lake Erie, and there was a freaking naval battle in there, which the US won. So at least the Americans had one out of the 5 Great Lakes in their control. In November, the US's steam ran out when they tried to take Montreal, and failed in that task. With winter setting in, the British used this to their advantage, and pushed back the Americans past the Niagara. Around this time, Napoleon got defeated, again, which allowed the British to reinforce Canada. The British also started raiding the South and freed many slaves, many of whom went on to fight for the British. So
well,
maybe the
nice.
British were the good guys in this war. Even with both sides beginning to run out of money for their war efforts and starting peace negotiations, the British under General Cockburn sailed into Chesapeake Bay and landed near DC. When the British entered DC, they began to burn down many public buildings, including the White House. It is even said that a Canadian militia did this, but I really could not find a reliable source on that, so let's just pretend so I can use that as clickbait in the title.
Okay, so is that what this is all about? So was it actually the British or was it this Canadian militia that did it? Yeah, I don't know. Before listening to that song that was about this incident, I don't know how I actually never knew that the White House was burnt down in the first place. It's very interesting. Again, is that just clickbait that Canada did it? Who actually did it?
General Cockburn also ordered his soldiers to destroy any C's they found, so the Americans could not abuse his name. Wonder why they did that. But then a big storm hit and the Brits had to go back on their ships. They tried to take Baltimore next, but failed. And Francis Scott Key made a pretty cool song about it. I don't know if you've heard it before. Meanwhile, down south, Andrew Jackson, not the president yet, went and attacked the British and Spanish, who weren't even in the war, at Pensacola. Then moved to New Orleans to fortify for an upcoming British attack. Meanwhile, back in Ghent, where peace negotiations were going on, the Brits proposed control of the Great Lakes region for themselves, and an Indian barrier stayed there. Now, of course, neither side really had any leverage, so on December 24th, 1814, peace was finally signed, with literally no border changes. Unfortunately, again, no texting, British forces still attacked New Orleans, but the Americans under Andrew Jackson repelled it. And then everyone finally got word of the war ending, and hence the War of 1812 ended in 1815. Great job on naming that, historians. So who really won? I don't know, but the natives sure didn't.
Yeah.
Thanks for...
Yeah, interesting video. So tell me what you think about that. It's interesting to know a little bit about the War of 1812. That's what I wanted to learn, and that was actually a very good, concise rundown of it. Obviously, the main incident there, which I thought I was watching a video about, was to hear about the Canadians burning down the White House. Yeah, tell me what actually happened there. Like, is there like some theory that it was Canadians? Was it the British? Was it like a combination of both? And yeah, interesting to see those little battles and skirmishes, even the one on that lake. A naval battle on a lake in there, and yeah, just interesting to see the different factions, whether it's the Canadians staying loyal to the British for their own like interests or what was going to benefit them, the Native Americans, even things like that with the slaves, the British releasing this, or yeah, kind of getting the slaves released, but then those slaves joining the British Army. That's actually something I never had any idea about. So maybe there'll be like a more in-depth rundown or documentary about that. I'll maybe try and find that. If you know of any good sources for that, tell me about that. I'd love to know about each of those in a bit more detail as well. But yeah, that's an interesting rundown. Tell me what you know about that war and the burning of the White House. Thanks.